Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I have a quick slide up there to give you an idea that this is going to be a 50-minute webinar with 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. Please use the chat window to type your questions or comments. And like the slide says, a link will be provided to you sometime next week of this session. So I am going to ask Mark to get started. And Mark, it's all yours.
Okay, Vera, thank you very much. I am here, and we're going to talk a little bit. And the chat, you're going to bring me to those. Do we cover the chat questions when they appear or at the end?
We are going to have questions at the end only.
Perfect, that's just fine. And I do have my chat window open, so I'll be able to see that. So, folks, my name is Mark Ames, and a little bit about me coming up on the next page here, but we're going to talk about common management system myths. And I'm going to move to here. I have a lot of experience and background information related to management system standards. And, you know, I began working with management system standards in 1988. I'm not sure I want to read all of these bullet points here word for word, but I founded AQS Management Systems, which is now DEKRA Services, in 1989. And then number C is the important one here, based on my experience. United States Technical Committee for ISO 9001 quality. It's called Technical Committee, or rather TC 176. I was a member 1992 to 2016, vice chair 2013 to 2016, and a vice chair kind of leads the role along with the chair and the secretary in providing feedback and authoring these standards. And then I was the United States Interpretation Committee chair for ISO 9001 from 2011 to 2016. And then I attended for 20 years the ISO 14000, which is Technical Committee 207. And then one thing I did, because we're going to come back and talk about this in E, the American National Standards Institute, the ANSI ANAB Management System Accreditation Council. And I was involved in that for 12 years, and that is the group that provides the rules for accrediting certification bodies, auditing certification bodies, and especially to the different standards as these standards come available. And I was a voting member of that for a dozen years. And then International Communication Committee member, and I was the author of the first in the United States, first ISO 9001 Certified Lead Auditor Training Program, and the ISO 14001 Environmental. And what I'd like to do is begin here on the next page. Well, first I'm going to do the agenda, then we're going to begin on the next page after this. I'm going to do a brief background related to the management system standards. A lot of what I'm going to say has to do with ISO 9001, but that's where the myths and the rumors and the misinformation began. And then it rolled from ISO 9000 into most of the rest of the management system standards. So the 6 myths I'm going to talk about are listed on this page, but we're going to come back and talk about them one at a time. And then down at the bottom, that bottom bullet, there have been 2 detailed studies of management system standards and the results that they achieve. And we're going to do a brief presentation that summarizes that. And then on the last couple pages, we're going to go into the grisly details about what does a management system do and what do the different management systems do. And I will talk about that in detail. So we're going to go here and some brief background information related to management system standards. And this is where I begin by saying ISO 9001 was the first, published by the International Organization for Standardization, published in 1987. And what's happened with that, and I'm sorry, many of you know the answers to this already, but ISO 9001 forms the basis for the quality management system standards, and it ties to the aerospace standard AS9100, the medical device, which is the ISO 1345, the automotive, which is the 16949, TS 16949, and then again, some of the requirements, many of the requirements, and many of the myths rolled down to the 14,000 and the 45,001. And there are currently, in publication down on the bottom of this page, over 40 management system standards that are published by the International Organization for Standardization. And I just listed 4 of them here. There's the Energy Management System, Information Security Management System Standard, Anti-Bribery Management System Standards, Agricultural Crop Management Systems. There's a standard for traffic safety on highways, and I don't know much about many of these. I do understand ISO 50001, and I do understand the ISO 22006 standards, so there's a bunch of them that I'm familiar with, and most of them I'm not. So the comment I'd like to make at this time, after the publication of ISO 9001, and I was at the meeting, it was in Atlanta, Georgia, when there was somebody that ISO 9001 had been published, and ISO 14001 had just been published, but had not had a lot of inputs from the Environmental Protection Agency. And a gentleman that has become a friend of mine over the years, he wasn't a friend at this time, but I met him and shook his hand, was one of the speakers in Atlanta, Georgia, and he worked for the Environmental Protection Agency, and I said, what do you guys think of this Environmental Management System Standard, ISO 14001? And his response was, I don't know, I think it's just a bunch of paperwork and a bunch of stuff. He wasn't really horribly negative, but he was a little bit cynical about it. And 2 years later, at the 14001 committee meeting in Washington, D.C., I walked in, and there he was, and I remembered him. And I said, my goodness, you're here at the meeting. And he said, yeah, the Environmental Protection Agency has done some data. And what they have found is organizations that become certified to ISO 14001 virtually never have an environmental performance problem, and they virtually never violate a regulation published by the Environmental Protection Agency. So I'm here to represent the Environmental Protection Agency. The point I'd like to make on this is that all of these standards deliver value. That's the point. And the 40 that are listed down below, the 4 of them that are listed are the 40. The 9001, 14001, 45,001. 9001 is the widest use in the world. 14,001 is the second widest. 45,001 is not the third. I think it's like the 4th, but I don't remember the data on that. But these are the ones that people talk about. Another reason I'm talking about these 3, again, mostly about 9001, which is where this began and where the myths rolled out. Some of the other standards do not follow the format and the layout. From a standards perspective, this is called Annex SL. You don't need to know that or memorize that. But on the committee, and as vice chair of the committee and as a member of the committee for essentially 30 years, we try to align the standards so it's easier for organizations to use multiple standards as they go through this. And I would like to then move on to right here as we do this. It's near the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the top line up there, Eli Whitney, and I remember learning about Eli Whitney when I was, I don't know, in junior high school probably, and he's a guy that built the cotton gin, designed, built, and ended up mass producing the cotton gin. And in the year 1798, which is now over 220 years ago, his concepts and ideas that he used for building muskets for the United States Army, do this, do this, do this. He had a list. don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Prior to Eli Whitney, muskets were made by individual craftsmen, and they were working in the barn or the shed behind their house. They worked by themselves or 2 or 3 or 4 members of their family. But he had people, many more people, because he had a contract with the United States Army. And what he did evolved through the 1800s, through the 1900s, and ended up getting assigned a number, which was ISO 9001, and it was published in 1987. So another point I'm going to make throughout this presentation as we do this here is these standards are always changing and always evolving. Now, I don't mean every day or every year. We'll come to that. I have a page on that. So then the concepts that were in management systems eventually became adopted by the environmental group, first published in 1996. Then the concept contained in management system was adopted by Occupational Health and Safety, and that was published in 2018. Now, I have to be fair. The Occupational Health and Safety Standard, widely used, was published much earlier than that, but it was not published as an ISO standard. ISO standing for the International Organization for Standardization. And I don't know the exact date, but I would say it's more than 20 years before that. I'd have to look it up. Another really critical concept is below that third bullet, the second to the last paragraph from the bottom. What I would like to say is these standards are authored by an international committee. Participation from the nations around the world that choose to be involved, and they use a consensus-based approach. Experts and users sit down and say, we need to do this, and then somebody stands up and says, no, we don't, and then the conversation begins. And these meetings are very, very, very positive, ongoing, and there's a lot of really good communication. I've attended many, 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 many of the international meetings, especially as the vice chair for the United States. Another reason I began with 9,000, 14,000, and 45,000, they're part of a group of standards where the numbering system, they're called clauses within the standard, wherever possible, are aligned. The numbers for document control and management review and employee competence are mostly the same, virtually always, but there's some few exceptions. And then the language itself. I can remember being on a committee for several years where we reviewed and coordinated the language with some of the other standards, and they said, why can't you make this identical to this one? And there were sometimes reasons why they couldn't, and sometimes they were able to make the change and it worked. The final thing on this page I'd like to say is from a update and change perspective. Most management system standards are reviewed every 5 years. Now, there's some exceptions to that. The nations can come together and vote, and I have seen this happen, and they say, boy, we don't like that last thing we wrote. We need to change it now, and perhaps only 2 years have gone by. But there's a scheduled review every 5 years. And then some management system standards are called technical specification. They're ISO/TS. An example of that is the automotive standard, ISO TS 16949, and they don't review it every 5 years. They vote to review an update. So the update can be less than 5 years, can be more than 5 years, and it's really done through a consensus process, and it's focused on ongoing improvements over a period of time. Anyway, go to the next page here. All management system standards, all of them, without exception, are based on a preventive approach within the management system, and we're going to go into this. And we'll start with the Eli Whitney example because it's the oldest by far, but all of the other standards use the same approach, just a different content. environmental, health and safety, food safety, energy management, information security. So beginning with the musket craftsman that Eli Whitney had, he had hired between 10 and 15 musket craftsmen, and they were all experienced, highly experienced, and they were working in the shed or the barn behind their house, and they all had very, very, very different opinions and ideas regarding dimensions and the length and where do we put this and how do we connect these two things together. And what was happening, these musket craftsmen were very, very knowledgeable and very creative. And one of the people would say, we're going to make a change here. This is better if you make it longer or shorter or thinner or thicker or whatever the case might be, or we're going to attach it differently. And what would happen is they began, again, this is an early stage mass production. Today we would not call it mass production, but back in the late 1700s, it was definitely mass production. And but they didn't always coordinate the changes with the others. And they made the thing longer or thinner or shorter. And down the assembly line, somebody was putting this together, and they'd say, hey, this doesn't fit. It's too long, or it's too short, or it's too fat. And so Whitney saw this happen, saw it happen again, saw it happen again, and after seeing it several times, he wrote the first rule. And the rule was, you can't make a change unless it goes through an approval process. And that is essentially the first concept within management system. And actually these first three that are listed there are all among the beginning. I can't tell you whether it was the first or it was a tie. I think he began writing this down and enforcing it. And then the musket craftsman would assign work to the frontline laborers, and these laborers were often school kids, very young, many of whom could not read. And he would assign, or the musket craftsman would assign the work to the young kids, and when they tried to do it, it often didn't work because they didn't know how. They were just doing what they had been told to do. And so Whitney came up with another rule. Let's for now call these rules. And his rule was, don't assign work to anyone unless you know they're competent to do the work. Well, that was a good idea too. And then problems that occurred needed to be solved, and many of these happened repeatedly. Oh, we got that problem today. Oh, wow, 3 days from now we have it again, and next week it happened again, and the week after that it happened. And the problem kept coming back and coming back and coming back. And Whitney, being a very bright guy, what he said and what he put into his rule book was, when a problem occurs, first solve the problem. And then, and as needed, solve the cause of the problem. Dig down deep. Now, sometimes you didn't have to solve the cause, but he wanted everyone to be looked at. What caused this thing? And can we attack the problem in a way that it doesn't come back again? So looking at number 4, and number 4 goes far into the future. It actually goes to today. Many, many, many additions and changes were made to what Whitney did, and that evolved into ISO 9001. Actually, it evolved eventually into what Henry Ford was doing. I think it was 1912 or 1913 when he was doing the first mass-produced cars, and Henry Ford added to the list, and the military and different contractors around the world added again during the Second World War. And many, many of these changes, they're continuing today. And I was on the committee for many years, and we talked about the changes. It's part of the process. Changes and improvements continue on an ongoing basis today. The thing that I'd like to say here, and this is really important, all management system standards are based on common sense. How do we achieve results, and how do we achieve the following 4 goals that are listed there? And number 1, how do we optimize the achievement of intended results? The results of the standard, whether it's environmental, health and safety, food safety, information security, as the case might be. How do we achieve the results? How do we prevent problems, whether it's document control, change management, correcting a problem? The third one, this is a big ticket item, and I'd like to get everybody to think kind of hard about this one. Number 3, the goal of a standard is to provide confidence. Well, customers need to say, boy, I trust this. Yeah, that's good. Owners, they needed to say, okay, we're doing good here. Regulatory bodies, workers want to keep their job. If you're making a crummy product, pretty soon you're out of business. And many, many, many others. And over time, people needed to feel confident. All of this group of people I have listed here, plus many, many others, I think, that intended results are being achieved. And I have to tell a brief story here. At one of our meetings, and I think it was in 2013, as we were going through the changes for 9001, we had a woman who was representing Great Britain, lived in London, and it was her first meeting, and she said, as we were all, for the whole week, these meetings are twice a year and they last a whole week, she stood up and asked a question on the last day, and she said, everybody's talking about customers. You've been talking about customers. Well, we don't understand that in the healthcare business. Now, she had a PhD in psychology, and she counseled people that were having mental health problems related to their illness or to an injury, perhaps. That's what she did. And she said, the government pays for our services. We don't care about the government. If your child breaks their arm when they fall off a bicycle, and you take them to the hospital, we want to work with that child and their family. We don't care what the government wants. Well, everyone in the room thought that was a pretty darn cynical response, but she made a point. But the standard has expanded, and now most of the standards, 9001, 14001, 45001, they talk about interested parties. So it's not just customers who are receiving the service, it's others who have an interest. How do we get to the result? And that's the confidence line on there, number 3. And then number 4, the other common approach is we're going to edit, change the requirements. We learn lessons. We got a lesson, and we can make an edit or a change and publish it again in 5 years or 3 years or whatever the schedule happens to be. What about the needs of those using the standard? And the changes happen. Changes are suggested, and the selected experts sit down and talk about it. This is an international consensus-based approach. And somebody says, we ought to do this. Well, we sit down and we would talk about that. And sometimes we would argue a bit, but we'd reach consensus and we move forward. So the 4 points that are listed on this page I think are really important because all management system standards fulfill all 4 of those points right there. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go back, and we're almost done with the background information. We're going to get into the myths here in just a minute. This change and ongoing improvement process related to ISO 9001 and the same model for 9001 was used by the environmental and the health and safety and the food safety and the energy management and all the other standards that are out there. And the standards began to evolve and they began to change. And I'd like to talk about the word evolution in that top line up above the bullet points. One of the key points is that we're going to keep the standard up to date. The needs of users may change over time. and I was involved in this. We had ISO 9001, which was used mostly in manufacturing and still is. But I was on a committee that was creating a guidance document for how to use ISO 9001 in agriculture. In fact, in particular, agricultural crops. So those users of ISO 9001 on a farm, they have different needs, and the needs may change over time. And that causes the authors of the standard and the people on the committee to look at it and say, can we do something about this? New user groups, second bullet that's up there. And then inputs that are collected from around the world come from experts in a wide variety of countries. And I can't remember how many countries on average attended the meetings, the international meetings. Australia, Portugal, Russia, China, Japan. We had on average, I would say probably 80 to 85 different countries attending these meetings, and we talk about it. And ultimately, those that were there discussed, improved, recommended changes, and they listened to the inputs. And the whole idea is to make this sustainable and beneficial going forward. That second bullet from the bottom, the wording and the adjustments to the content, we're focused on improving the ability of the standard to achieve the intended outcomes. And then they wanted it to continue to improve the results, improve the use, expand the use in many cases. ISO 9001 continued to evolve over time. And some of these, but not all of them, are more recent changes. ISO 9001 was republished in 2015, and the old version of the standard was withdrawn from use in 2018. But the language in the newer versions, and quite frankly, the language used in historical versions, were intended to accomplish the following, and the bullets are listed there. Increase the emphasis on continual improvement. How do we make things better? How do we make things better next week, next year? Change the product, change the process, change the way people are doing things. That second bullet's one of the myths we're going to come to here in just literally a minute. The emphasis has been removed from documentation. Okay, documents are still there, but old version of the standard, the 1987, had lots and lots of documents, and the auditor said, write it down. We're going to talk about that. That is the first myth. And we've moved away. That third bullet may be, in my opinion, the most important change that has happened, and that was published in the year, actually published on September 15th of the year 2015. Now, the words in there in bold, day to day, those are my words. But the standard, in fact, all of these standards, the three that we're talking about here, talk about business activities, business processes. And those of you that are using that, you can find that in clause 5.1 in the standard. All three of them will have that. Some of the words are a bit different, but they talk about how do you link this? In fact, it's a requirement. Organizations, let me say this differently. Top management is required to build a linkage between the ISO standard, between the management system standard, and their day-to-day business activities. My words are day-to-day, but if you read the guidance document on clause 5.1, you'll find this is what's being described. So now you have to run your business. Okay. Increase focus on customer expectations. Increase responsibilities for top management. Engaging people and achieving the results. Third bullet from the bottom emphasizes the interconnectivity between the organization's processes and the people that do that. If somebody does something in one department and it can affect another department, there's got to be better communication. Personnel have to understand their role in helping the organization meet its objectives, and ultimately, there's increased emphasis on the identifications of risks and opportunities. And I'd like to point out at the bottom of this that many others, I've got many others in bold red down at the bottom. Okay, I just did a summary of the high items that I thought were important here. Let's get into the 6 myths. The first one's the long one. I've got several pages on some of these myths. And in green at the top, management systems require excessive documentation. And this was largely true in 1987, but I, as a consultant, as a trainer, as an auditor, going way back to late 80s and early 90s, I often heard people complain about all the doggone paperwork. Okay? The people that were using ISO 9000 in 1987 tended to be larger, tend to be more high technology, which drew them to more procedures, more work instructions. They tended to use documents because the marketplace that they served, high risk, high cost, large organizations, they demanded a level of accountability, and they were often heavily regulated. Jet aircraft, airbags for cars, whatever the case might be. Many procedures were required because that's what they were used to in their industries. And very little feedback going backwards to reduce documents. And then some highly experienced auditors at that time, they were highly experienced back in 1987, and they had lots and lots of experience with the first 3 bullet points that are up at the top of this list. As a result, they often focused on the following. And I've seen many audits that were done, especially in the early years, where the auditor would come in and say, could I see your procedure, please? Procedure, as the case might be. Well, how this has changed, there were 28 documented procedures in 1987. Okay, in 1994, this was reduced to 6 documented procedures. And in the year 2015, it was reduced to 0 procedures. So the committee is listening. And they've replaced some words, and we will talk about that here in a minute, okay? And I've heard these things over the years, especially in the early years, not so much today, but I still hear it. People would say, document what you do and do what you document. How much do we document? We'll document it all. Just get it documented, it's a requirement. And then I've heard top managers say, look, our auditor requires evidence, so let's give them the paperwork that they need. And then I've heard, this is a bad one, that the bottom bullet, the 4th bullet. I've heard this multiple times in my life, just traveling around the country and traveling around the world, quite frankly. I've heard people say, I've heard top management say, well, we follow our procedure when the auditor is here, but it's ridiculous when we do that. So when the auditor is gone, we do what's right for our business. And that is a huge barrier. And that draws people into focusing on documents that are of no value. Okay? The beginning of the change, we reduced the number of standards. Reduced the number of procedures. And then the definition of procedure, I've got in green, got emphasized a lot. I remember us emphasizing this on our training going way back to the early 90s. Procedure, it's a specified way to carry out an activity. But they put a note underneath. I've got that in green. And it said, procedures can be documented or not. Here's the way we do it. How do you do that? Well, we have a qualified person doing it. That's what the procedure says. Or we have a tool or software, jigs and fixtures. And the 2 points that are listed up above, reducing to 6 and eventually to 0, was intended to reduce the widely accepted, internationally accepted perception that everything had to be documented. That is still out there today. I still hear it occasionally, much less than in the late 80s and the early 90s. And then what this did, big benefits, it expanded the use of ISO 9001. Now remember, we're also going to link this to 14,001 and 45,001, and quite frankly, virtually all of the other standards. It allowed smaller businesses. I remember about 7 or 8 years ago, I did an audit of a farm south of San Jose, California, and it was acreage, and they had actually multiple farms, and they were all growing expensive crops. And the one that I audited, they were growing organic fruit, raspberries, strawberries, and they had only 3 people working there. They had 10 acres. How many procedures do they need? Well, the whole idea, not that many. Okay, we're sticking with myth number 1 about all the documentation. The standards were revised 2000, 2008, 2015. The number of procedures dropped to 0 and was replaced by text in the standard. And I've got 2 check marks down at the bottom. Today, 4.4.2, and this is essentially the same in virtually all of the standard, and I will say it's paraphrased. It's not word for word. But clause 4.4.2 of ISO 9001 says, to the extent necessary, the organization shall maintain documented information to support the operation of its processes. To the extent necessary, the organization now makes that decision. So the idea is chip away at this myth about lots and lots and lots of paperwork, although the myth is still there. And then clause 7.5.1, the organization's quality management system shall include documented information determined by the organization. And that's there. The words were put in there to de-emphasize documents, but I still hear, oh, just document it. Especially if I'm doing an audit and I find a nonconformity. And then one of the things I do after the audit is I have to check on how they're solving the problem. And I cannot tell you how many times, you know, I say, what is your plan for solving this nonconformity? That's my job as an auditor. And they say, oh, well, we're going to write another procedure. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we come up here on the next pages. Okay, 2 things I'd like to get everybody to think about. 2 points listed below. I've got this laid out on the next couple pages, and then we're going to move on to myth number 2. There is a balance between risk and cost. Those of you listening to me here now should pay attention to this. I've got a diagram that shows it. Think about it. It will change the way you think about documentation, especially excessive documentation and excessive paperwork. I've had people say, God, we've got a 3-foot stack of paperwork here in our building. Well, I don't think anybody's ever had a 3-foot stack of paperwork. You know, maybe you've got 6 inches of paperwork. I don't know, but even that's quite a lot. But there's a link between risk and cost. And then number 2, not understanding or knowing when you need a document is actually needed, in addition to the consideration of alternatives. And we'll talk a little bit about alternatives. What do you need to ensure adequate control in order to achieve specified results? And there is a trade-off. And on the horizontal line, I've got the amount of documentation. Now, could you imagine, please, as we draw this graphic up here, on the far right of the bottom row, it's horizontal. Let's just pretend that everything is documented. And as you move to the left, you have fewer documents. As you move further to the left, you have fewer and fewer documents. As you move all the way to the left on the horizontal line, you don't have any documents, none. So you have choices. Document nothing, document a little bit, document a lot, document everything. By the way, it is impossible to document everything. This is just me giving a representative sample. And then the horizontal line comes up, and we're tracking cost in terms of dollars and risk. And we've got them both on the up graph. And here's what actually happens when you put things to work on this chart. If you go too far to the right, okay, too much documentation, results in increased cost due to the bureaucracy and the paperwork and the nonsense. So we can get rid of all of our documents, except the problem is, if you get rid of too much document, you increase the risk. Cost goes up because of poor performance. Cost and risk. Well, there's a point where you can minimize cost and risk by finding the right amount of documentation. It's just perfect. We're going to eliminate the bureaucracy, and we're only going to have paperwork where it's needed, but we're not going to get rid of all of the paperwork, because then people make mistakes, they don't know what's going on, and the cost goes up again. So this would be a point that I think would be an important point. It's a trade-off. How much document do we need? The next point that I'm going to make here is people don't understand. I have used this PowerPoint slide many hundreds of times in the last 25 years. I've done this in speeches. I gave a speech with PowerPoint presentation probably 20 or 25 years ago in San Francisco, California at a quality conference. And I asked the audience, and it was an auditorium full of people. I said, okay, you have a choice to make. Task number 1 is simple to do. Doggone it, simple. Nothing complicated about it. You know, and if we get it wrong, the risk is really pretty low. We can fix that really quickly without a whole lot of time, effort, or cost. So simple task, very low risk. Task number 2 is modestly complex with modest risk. Task number 3 is highly complex with extreme risk. Now, my question to you is, how would you answer that? We have over 100 people here, and so I'm not going to ask for feedback, although we'll take a question on that at the end. And let me tell you now, the answer that I virtually always get is people say, boy, you got to document task number 3. Task number 3 is the one where we actually need it. The problem is, now please think, I'm going to make a point here. The problem is, if you go to task number 3 and you're in the operating room laying on the table and the doctor comes up and he said, we're going to put you to sleep in a couple of minutes and proceed with the brain surgery, and then the doctor turns to the nurse and says, have you got the procedure for this? Where do we cut, and how deep do we cut, and what kind of tool do we use to make the cut? And you do not want to hear that. And now you're falling asleep, okay? That's a bad, bad thing. There's no procedure for that. Now, there are procedures in the operating room that help you avoid forgetting things. You know, set up the temperature, set up the heart monitor. It's a checklist. If you look at number 2, drive a car. There are no procedures for driving a car. Now, there are things that are required that a teenager learning to drive a car, he will read and say, and the procedure will say, remember to turn the blinker on, remember not to hit the brakes too hard, and so on and so on and so on. But when you're driving a car, you don't have a procedure. That's done, it's a skill and knowledge based. And by the way, performing brain surgery, skill, knowledge, education. The simple task, Betty Crocker puts a recipe on the back of every single box of cake mix. And if it's me, I got to read that. I've got 3 kids and I've got 7 grandkids. And my wife has the grandkids come over, you know, a day or 2 before Christmas, and we bake a cake, and I end up with that. No, we have to read the procedure. I have to. So the point I'd like to make is everybody has to think about the need for a document, and that can help you dispel this myth. Okay, you don't need documents for everything we use: education, training, skills, experience, tooling, jigs, fixtures, as the case might be. And we're going to add myth number 2. We've got 6 here. Some of these are very short. The next myth, and by the way, I worked with a group of people that that authored a couple of articles, and the myth, the document management system as a whole don't add value. to what I actually do, my business. But I have to have a management system because my customers want me to have it. And all three of the new revisions, 9,000, 14,000, 45,000, include the words requiring the integration of the management system into the organization's day-to-day business processes. Now, the words day-to-day are mine. But if you read the guidance on clause 5.1, the words spell that out. What do we do here to operate the business? And then at the bottom of that first paragraph, this text, I've kind of paraphrased it there, will deliberately add it to all three of these standards to help ensure that they achieve business results. So let's go back to the myth. Myth number 2. Management systems don't add value. Well, the whole point is that they do add value. They're now tied, locked, handcuffs to what the organization actually does. Okay? So let's go back to the clauses. Now, I have a caution on this, and I have the word paraphrased, italics, bold, and underlined. Extracted from clause 4.1. This is all intended to support and eliminate the concept that management systems don't add value. From clause 4.1, it says the organization shall determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and strategic direction, and that affect its ability to achieve the intended results of its management system. Okay, the organization is responsible for deciding where we're going. It's a business. That's the point. That's the bridge. Clause 5.1, this is the clause I pointed out before, and I can't remember. I think it's 5.1.B or C. I can't remember for those of you that are looking at it. Top management is responsible for ensuring the integration of the management system requirements into the organization's business processes. And finally, 6.1, when planning the management system, the organization shall consider issues from clauses 4.1 and determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. Well, if you look at your strategic direction, and that point in 6.1 says go back to 4.1, if you know where you're going, then you identify risks and opportunities, then the risks and opportunities within your management system standard are supporting your strategic direction. And you want to attack the things that are impacting your ability to get where you're going to go, your strategic direction. And then the final one is 6.1.2. Actions taken to address risks and opportunities shall be proportionate. Key word is proportionate. The potential impact on the conformity of the management system and its outcomes, including its day-to-day business processes. And I've done some paraphrasing because the three standards don't use identical text, but I've captured the meaning here, okay? Let's move on. Page 2, they don't add value. Again, we're not done with this topic. All of the newly authored management system standards have been created to be aligned with an organization's day-to-day business processes. This is a tip, take advantage of this alignment. Do what is right for your organization. Do what's right for your business. And that ties to profit, ties to happy customers, ties to happy regulatory bodies, a safe work environment, occupational health and safety. Second bullet, all management system standards from the first publication in 1987 were specifically created to help organizations achieve results, avoid mistakes, save resources, time, and money. The end. We've just gotten better at it, and we've opened it up from high-tech, high-risk products going back to 1987, and we're now using this for people who are making inexpensive office furniture and are planting crops in the dirt and harvesting the crop to feed somebody's cattle, as the case might be. And then my final point, organizations that are not achieving value from the management system standard, those folks need to rethink what they're doing and modify their methods, okay? You've got to achieve alignment with their business operations. If you do that, it will achieve value. Third myth, And if I could just make a comment here, I'm going to give you some references coming up to an article that I wrote. There was a team of 4 of us. I wrote the first 2 drafts, and then we had the other 3 people. We talked about it, and we debated, and you got to cover this, and here's a better word for that, and round and round. I'm going to give you a reference to these 2 articles, and you can download that if you choose. I just recommend if you do that. I think that article is both of the articles I'm going to recommend are helpful. Myth number 3 is management systems are costing me a whole lot of money. Boy, I waste all my time, I waste all my money, I've invested a lot in this, and it's just a waste of time. Well, Harvard University, and this is a big deal, Harvard University studied this related to 9001, and I'm going to show you some data to 14001. Okay, Harvard University was detailed and was not based on the opinion or the surveys of the people they were auditing. They went and looked at the bottom line. Profit margin, who worked there, pay, how much money was being made. What they did is they gathered data from 1,000 organizations that had implemented 9001 and were certified, and 1,000 organizations that had not implemented 9001. And what they found, sales increased by 9%, the number of employees increased by 10%, and not only did employees increase, they paid their people more, and profit increased. And we've got more data here on the last couple pages of the Harvard University study. Okay, so we're going to look at a bunch of other data on that. And here's some data from the Wharton School of Risk Management, and it was actually called Wharton Risk Management Decision Process Center, and they looked at 14,000. 14,000, as many of you know, is environmental. And what they found was the benefits of 14001 extended far, far beyond the achievement of bottom line performance benefits. But they did achieve bottom line performance benefits. 65% users of 14001 found their first year cost savings related to the environment was over 25,000. Okay. 27% of users who were using 14001 found their first year cost savings over 100,000. Well, I imagine it's the bigger organizations that got to the 100,000 or more, and the smaller organizations went to 25,000. Of course, some of them there's a smaller number of larger organizations, so that number is 27. But that third bullet, 99% of users of 14001 found an ongoing annual cost savings of $25,000 greater over a period of time compared to those that hadn't done it. Okay, and additional data is presented at the end of this presentation. I'm nearing the end here, folks, so just hang in there with me. We're going to go to the end. Management systems don't allow my organization to be flexible and innovative. Well, that's the whole point of the changes. And I still see this when I do an audit. Not all audits, much better at this than back in the 1990s. And all management system standards published by ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, have been created and have evolved in the last 34 years to allow, and the words have changed again and again and again, allowing increased flexibility and customized use, regardless of the size, the risk, the products. And here's what was added. I've got 3 bullet points at the bottom. Clause 4.1, again, paraphrased. I'm trying to bring all of the standards into alignment, and some of the words are different, so I'm calling it paraphrased. Clause 4.1 essentially says, all organizations are required to determine their own context. Well, I'm going to give you my definition of context. Those of you that have a copy of any of these standards can look it up. But to simplify the definition, the organization defines its context. That is, my words now, who they are and what they do. Well, we make airbags for cars, and it saves lives. The next business over, they make inexpensive office furniture that's sold at the local lumber yard. Well, they're going to create different management systems. Some monitor hazardous chemicals in the water supply. Boy, that's an environmental issue. And some of them simply recycle paper at the local garbage pit. 4.2, all organizations are required to identify their interested parties. Interested party is an organization or a person that the management system has been created to meet the interested party's requirements. Customers, as the case might be. Managers, workers, owners, people that live in the neighborhood. Okay, I did a big environmental project in Oregon here about 5 years ago, and one of the issues was they were putting smoke up their smokestacks as they were processing their products, and the neighbors were saying, "What is that terrible smell?" Oh, how about the people that live in the neighborhood? Could they be an interested party? And the organization makes this choice. Then, the key point here is 6.1. All organizations are required to consider 4.1, context, 4.2, interested parties, when they determine the risks and opportunities. Are we doing bad things to our business? Are we doing bad things for our interested parties? Number 5, management systems do not require certification. Therefore, there's no need to get certified. Okay, brief summary, best practices, for example, assign competent people, control your processes, control your documents. I'm not going to read this. All of them are there, and you can think of another 50 if you wanted to. So now, the paragraph below that, you've got all these good things in that limited number of bullets that I have. Certification of the management system is done by an independent and accredited organization who uses qualified management system auditors to verify results and, as needed, ensuring actions are taken to fix the problems, fix the components of the management system that are not working. The key words are in bold red at the bottom and underlined. When a certification body comes to audit an organization, that certification provides confidence to the organization, confidence to its customers, and confidence to other interested parties. Now, I've got a diagram here, and I've drawn this intentionally. The big ellipse at the left is all the stuff that an organization does to get their management system working. Identify environmental aspects, identify health and safety dangers, qualify your purchasing and select your suppliers. Then to the right, all of the activities on the left ellipse, document control, employee competence, corrective action, management review, all that stuff. Okay, once all of that's done, the organization checks on itself. They use an internal audit. The results of the internal audit are fed both to the management review and the corrective action process. Management review pushes back for the internal audit and says we need more audits, we need less audits. Corrective action is taken, internal audit goes out and checks it again, and management review provides direction and resources to the corrective action process. Okay, I pulled those three things off to the right because that's the point. The point that I want to make is all, 100%, all management systems that are effective check on themselves, top management is aware, and corrective action is taken. Now, let's move on here. I'm down to, I think I have 5 or 4 pages left. Okay, in green at the bottom, a certification body comes in, and they audit the organization to verify that all of those processes, all those activities, document control, corrective action, employee communication, yeah, it's all working, or it's not. And if it's not, they tell them, and they have to take a fix. Okay, the certification body comes in and does that to these environmental activities, health and safety, quality activities. But now the next page is key. In addition to checking on your processes, what they check on is, are you finding your own problems with your internal audit? Is management review, is top management aware of the problems? Are the corrective actions being fixed? Are you getting feedback back? Okay. The certification body is independent. They're looking at this. The whole value of a certification body audit is the organization can audit itself and overlook 101 things. Hopefully not that many. Or wait a minute, maybe they're doing an internal audit and they're going easy on themselves. And the customer that receives the output from the management system, yeah, well, the organization is not very competent or they don't care. Okay? So the certification body checks on the internal audit, the management review, the corrective actions to see if the organization is finding and fixing and improving their management system. So the true green boxes down at the bottom, they've taken a look and they see what you're doing. Then they take a look at how you're checking in on your own activities and providing feedback on that. And finally, we come to the big ticket item here. Down at the bottom on the left, all certification bodies are audited on at least an annual basis by an accreditation body. The accreditation body is independent. They come in and they make sure that the certification body is taking a good hard look and following the model in the green boxes. Are you looking at what they're doing? And are they finding and fixing their own problems? Huge advantages to this. It returns value. Now, nobody's overlooking value to the organization. Yes, you're missing things. No, you're not. Value to customers. Oh, you know, they say they're doing this management system, but when somebody comes in and takes a look, we find out that they're not. So I like it when my supplier, my customer, my partner, my neighbor is certified because I'm confident. And the final myth is management systems are just a fad. They're going to go away. And they work. They deliver value. Management system standards continually reviewed where necessary, modified, updated, improved. The International Organization for Standardization has published rules about that. And I was heavily involved in that for 30 years, and I was vice chair, number 2 person for the United States, and we traveled to Australia, to Portugal, to Russia, to China, to Japan, and everywhere in between. And we met with the international team and we talked. Profoundly valuable. The whole idea is we're going to make appropriate changes. And one of the votes, second bullet from the bottom, if a standard is no longer returning value in the different nations of the world, vote. One of the votes is, no, we're going to eliminate it. It's no longer value. Or the vote can be, no, we're going to fix it. Okay, and we assess the shortcoming and we make the changes and we're ready to go here. All right, brief summary, hard data. Last couple of pages here. From the Harvard study, and by the way, there's a ton of data. Okay, what the Harvard data found when it studied ISO 9001, higher profit, sales increase of 9%, number of employees grew by 7%, wages of the people that work there grew by 7.7%, benefits of smaller organizations were statistically higher than larger, and significantly higher rate of corporate survival. Now, down at the bottom, my name is Mark Ames. You can see that second bullet from the bottom. If you Google Mark Ames, my name, and then ISO 9001 value, that's an article that I wrote, and we had a bunch of people that I was working with on a team at the Accreditation Council for the United States. And we came together and we wrote an article. If you go to Mark Ames, ISO 9001 value, you can download that, print it out, take it to your manager, supervisor, top management, whatever the case might be. Okay, that's Mark Ames ISO 9000 value. Right below that, or you can go to Mark Ames Management System Myths, authored by the same 4 people. Our names are on the top. And you can look at the data from Harvard, or you can look at the data from Wharton School, and you can find out what it was. Next thing, here's a summary of the Wharton study. This has to do with the environmental, and you can look at the left. I'm not going to read the data. And this time you can look up Mark Ames ISO 9000, ISO 14001 value, Mark Ames Management System Myth. And I'm now back to the end of my myths conversation. It is my sincere hope, and we're going to turn it over for questions in a minute, that the pages that I went through there, the 34 pages I think, demonstrate that management system standards, they deliver value, and that's been the ongoing focus. They deliver value, and their use will very, very likely continue and grow over a period of time. Now, the data on this, I just looked this up this morning. There are 1,200,000 ISO 9000 certifications around the world. 1,217,000 businesses, organizations around the world that are ISO 9001 certified. That's a lot. ISO 14,000, there are 487,000 that are certified. And the health and safety 45,001, there are 62,889 organizations that are certified to ISO 45,000. And I'm now going to go to my last page, and I'm going to open the chat. And my chat has disappeared. Not sure what's happened.
So yeah, we've gone way over. So if anyone has any questions, we can address them quickly in about 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, I did go 5 minutes over, but we said we were going to break at 10 till. So I just had a lot to say, Vera. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. I see one question, a couple actually. Did regulatory agencies like EPA, OSHA, etc., have any input in ISO 9001, 14, and 45? They often look for documentation despite not requiring it.
Okay, let's talk about that. If you are an auditor, maybe you're auditing for the EPA or OSHA or whoever the case might be, and they come in and say, I want to see this documented information here. Show me the document. And you're working at the organization and you have read the requirements, and the requirements do not call for documented information. You turn to the auditor and you say, I'm sorry, you're asking for documented information. Could you show me, please, where there's a requirement that states documented information, documented procedures, or whatever is required? And if they can show you that there's a stated requirement, that you have a documented information, then you have to show it to them. If they can't show you that documented information is required, one thing that happens, there's all certification bodies are guided by a standard that's called ISO 17021, 17021. And that outlines the fact that all certification bodies have to have a defined methodology for an appeal or a complaint. Technically, they say, I want that documented. Practically, you can say, well, I'm not following what you want. I'm following the requirements that are printed in this standard.
Okay, so the next question is, do you know what portion of organizations certify and then abandon their certification?
I think it's relatively small. I have no data on that. I can think of maybe 1 or 2 companies I've worked with over the last 30 years, but I think those are financial reasons, going downhill, loss of customers, loss of business, loss of employees over a period of time. So I don't have any data on that. I have seen it. I think it's relatively rare.
Okay, and then is it worth to maintain a PFMEA when you don't have manpower to maintain them, meaning, I guess, management system?
What is a PS management system?
PFMEA.
I don't know what that is.
FMEA.
Oh, FMEA?
Yeah.
Oh, failure mode effect analysis? Oh, yeah. Well, that's a powerful tool. What it is, it's a powerful tool that aids an organization in identifying its risks. And I think that's good for anybody, anywhere in the world, whether you're certified to an ISO standard or not.
That's all the questions that I see. And someone has said, can you send us a copy of this presentation? And we won't send the presentation, but we'll send a link to the recording.
Okay.
We'll have that.
Well, folks, I hope this is helpful to you. I know I took a bit longer, but I had a bunch of things to say. I hope what I said was valuable.
Okay, so we'll be there for a couple more minutes. I'll leave the session open in case any of you thinks of a question. Otherwise, I want to thank all of you for your time and spending an hour with us, and hope to see you in a DECRA course in the future. Thank you and have a good weekend. Thank you,
Thanks,
Mark.
everybody. Thank you.